Open an old merchant's chest and you will find more than fragrant powder. Between bundles of rope and folded sailcloth might lie a slim ledger, ink faded but intent, prices, quantities, destinations. A single line could represent years of labor by island hands, long-distance voyages across unpredictable seas, and the decisions of men in distant offices who calculated profit in terms as abstract and cold as tonnage in exchange. That tiny seed, Myristica fragrans, became a hinge on which fortunes and fates turned. We begin with the tree because the story of nutmeg is a story that starts in the soil. Myristica fragrans is an evergreen that will grow into a modest tree, its fruit like an apricot at first glance, splitting open to reveal a glossy seed wrapped in a vivid red lace. The kernel is the spice we call nutmeg. The aril is mace, a different flavor register, but the same botanical origin. The flavor is complex, warm, resinous notes of pine and clove, a sweetness that lingers under the tongue, an aroma experts describe as both pungent and woody. Apothecaries in various parts of the world prized it for medicinal properties, against stomach ailments as a restorative tonic, even as an ingredient in perfumed unguents, and cooks loved its ability to sharpen and preserve. But what made nutmeg historically explosive was not only its taste, it was where it came from. The tree's native range was extremely narrow, a handful of islands in the waters we now call the Banda Sea, part of the larger Moluccas archipelago in maritime Southeast Asia. These islands were not vast continents rich in groves. They were small, densely inhabited clusters of volcanic soil and coral rock, where trees were tended and guarded by communities who understood their value. Unlike plants whose seeds drift or ride the currents for long distances, nutmeg did not have an obvious mechanism for oceanic dispersal. Its natural distribution remained tied to the hands and knowledge of the islanders who planted, harvested, and dried the spice. Because it could not be gathered at random on many shores, nutmeg's scarcity was geographic as well as cultural. Across Southeast Asia, long before Europeans thought to sail directly to these islands, nutmeg moved within complex regional networks. Local traders, seafaring merchants, and island households managed groves, stored bales, and exchanged spice for cloth, metal goods, and southern luxuries. For generations, the Banda people and their neighbors treated nutmeg not as an anonymous commodity, but as a resource embedded in social life, cultivation practices passed down through families, seasons of harvest tied to rituals, and trade relations shaped by long-standing alliances. This was not a market of anonymous intermediaries. It was a chain of human knowledge. The people of these islands controlled how much left their shores and to whom it would go. So imagine the scene before European contact. Slow boats under sail carving the inter-island sea lanes, Malay traders loading pods and bundles, spices wrapped in palm leaves and marked with the seal of a known house. Maps show only ink and distance, but someone in a Banda village could point to the exact tree that had fed a family for decades. That local expertise gave these communities leverage. They could regulate supply by choosing when and how much to trade. The spice's scarcity at a global level, how unknown palates in distant courts would prize it, was built on the intimacy of island cultivation. If one island controlled this seed, what would empires do to get it? This is the hinge where local life met global hunger. The first Europeans who navigated around Africa and across the Indian Ocean encountered these Asian trade circuits not as passive observers, but as competitors. Their goal was simple: cut out middlemen and carry profits home in chests and barrels. A single voyage that returned with cargo of spices could pay back years of investment, and for monarchs and merchants alike, the calculus was intoxicating. Ships bearing European flags began to appear in the eastern seas with increasing frequency, not simply as explorers of unknown waters, but as agents in a new commercial theater, the spice economy. The initial contacts were uneven. Early European ships relied on familiar tactics, barter, treaties, and an unsteady mix of diplomacy and intimidation. They hoped to secure friendly ports, storage rights, or trade privileges that would funnel spices into their networks without having to sail empty-handed through perilous waters. For a while, that arrangement worked in patchwork. Local traders continued to play a central role because they controlled both the product and the knowledge of its cultivation. But the appetite in European markets for nutmeg and mace grew faster than those traditional channels could safely or profitably supply. Two features of the European involvement deserve emphasis. First, European actors arrived with organizational forms and capital that were unprecedented in the region, company charters backed by monopolistic ambitions, state-like powers, and a willingness to use naval force. The Dutch, in particular, created an entity that was not merely a company, but a hybrid of merchant association and quasi-government. It could sign treaties, wage war, and administer overseas territories, functions that European monarchies sometimes delegated into private hands. Second, European markets, newly united by long-distance demand and banking systems, could translate rarity into extraordinary rents. A small cargo of nutmeg could sell for sums that, when converted back into an accounting of expenses and returns, meant enormous profits. It is tempting to reduce this to numbers, but the essential point is structural. Rare, place-bound spices, when plugged into global mercantile networks, became levers of political and military action. On the islands themselves, reactions to Europeans varied. Some communities sought ties with these newcomers as a way to expand markets. Others watched them warily. Local rulers were sometimes willing to negotiate, seeing benefits in access to iron tools, textiles, or new trading partners. But within a short span of time, the stakes escalated. Competition between European powers turned commercial rivalry into a strategic game. The party that could secure unbroken supplies of nutmeg would command a monopoly in the most lucrative European markets. Control of supply meant control of price, and control of price meant control of profit margins that could fund fleets, garrisons, and more commercial expansion. This is where the story of methods begins to darken. The tools of monopoly were not merely tariffs or exclusive contracts. They were also force, manipulation of local economies, and attempts to reshape the very geography of production. Agents of the trading companies experimented with a range of tactics, stationing garrisons at strategic points, negotiating exclusive purchase agreements with selected chiefs, and investing in settlements that replaced diversified island economies with plantations geared to export. The Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials, VOC, stood out not only for its scale but for the ruthlessness of its determinations. If a market could be cornered, the VOC believed, it should be cornered. If supply could be centralized, it should be centralized. How does a company bend a living landscape to its will? One method was to intervene directly in cultivation patterns, encourage or mandate planting of trees in areas under its control, restrict the right of others to plant or harvest, and at times remove those who resisted. Another method was market manipulation, buying up available supplies to create scarcity, offering low prices to local producers when competition was absent, and then selling at steep margins in Europe. Shipping logistics also mattered. Fleets that moved quickly and reliably could outcompete rivals and punish merchants who betrayed agreements. Finally, the transplantation of plants was a strategic tool. If the VOC could transport nutmeg trees or seedlings to other islands it controlled, it could break a geographic monopoly and diversify sources of supply under its own administration. Transplanting a tree is not a rhetorical sleight of hand, it is botanical labor. Seedlings are fragile. They demand care. Moving them across oceans required planning and patience. Seedlings tended in shipboard nurseries and replanted in new soils. But successful transplantation had long-term consequences. An empire that could propagate the tree beyond its original island could reduce reliance on a single source and thereby undercut the bargaining power of local cultivators. The result for island societies was dramatic. Where once many households managed groves and trade through long-established social patterns, increasingly their choices were constrained by company policies and the presence of foreign administrators. This shift toward control accelerated the already present inequalities of the spice trade. In Europe, nutmeg was a display of status. In Asia, it was woven into daily life and local exchange. An English noble might pay an exorbitant sum for a pound of ground nutmeg to flavor a sauce. On Banda and its sister islands, families harvested and dried the arils and seeds according to local seasons and markets. As the VOC and other European actors tightened their grip, the local producers lost not just income but autonomy. The grammar of production changed, from household-managed cultivation oriented toward regional trade to export-driven practices shaped by foreign contracts and military imposition. The human cost emerges most starkly in those moments when economic strategy became explicit coercion. There were instances where trade treaties were followed by demands for exclusive supply, and where refusal to comply prompted punitive expeditions. Records from the period indicate negotiations and their breakdowns, the arrival of armed ships, and decisions made by company officials determined to secure monopoly at almost any cost. At this point, the narrative becomes morally plain. An ordinary object of domestic use, a spice to enliven stews and preserve meat, was now a commodity worth protecting by force, and protectors were prepared to use violence to secure it. We must be cautious here about specifics that require archival verification. Exact dates of particular confrontations and precise casualty figures are items that need confirmation in primary sources. For those details, label them as indefinido until checked against scholarly records. What is not in doubt across multiple accounts is the pattern: local populations resisting exclusionary policies, company officials responding with military resources, and the gradual imposition of structures that turned islands into sources for export under colonial supervision. Contemporary letters and company logs, where they exist, reveal the calculations behind these actions, the language of cost and benefit, the cold accounting of expense versus potential profit. The human lives caught in that arithmetic appear only as collateral in the margins. Before the most dramatic episodes unfolded, the spice's allure had already reshaped markets and kitchens across continents. In European cities, new recipes and new fashions emerged. Nutmeg found its way into breads and pies, into medicines and festive dishes, and into the ceremonial rituals of dining that signaled social rank. Demand rippled back across the globe. Where once local trade networks sufficed, now a global appetite demanded scale. The result was a feedback loop. European demand increased the value of the spice, which in turn attracted more organized and forceful attempts by companies to guarantee supply. It helps to see the spice as both sensory object and abstract value. On a dining table, nutmeg is intimate, a dusting over custard, a sliver in mulled wine. In the ledgers of a trading house, the same seed is an entry in a column that decides the fate of ships, of contracts, of soldiers. The tension between these two registers, sensory pleasure and fiscal abstraction, is the central drama of the nutmeg story. How does a seasoning justify an empire's sword? How does a flavor justify displacement? There are forms of resistance and adaptation at every point in the story. Islanders negotiated, sometimes accepting limited partnerships with foreign traders in hopes of maintaining control over their lives. Traders in the wider Asian region continued to find ways to route spices through familiar networks, challenging monopolies not always by arms, but by the subtleties of allegiance and exchange. And, as European companies perfected methods of control, new economic actors, planters, administrators, and traders, emerged to run plantations that looked more like the agricultural enterprises later associated with colonial cash crops. Yet the heart of the narrative is the moment when commercial logic became imperial policy. The Dutch East India Company, with its ships and capital, possessed not only commercial ambition, but the administrative means to reshape landscapes. Its officials and captains corresponded about planting programs, the best soils for nutmeg, and the need to relocate populations who resisted labor demands. These were not abstract conversations. They were plans to remake how a place produced wealth. We must be careful with particulars here. The exact orders, the specific names attached to decisions, and the numbers involved should be verified. Some of these items remain clear in archival sources. Others require further scholarship and notation as indefinido. To grasp the scale of what was at stake, imagine a single household on a Banda island tending a cluster of nutmeg trees as their ancestors had. Their harvest, their drying huts, their trade network sustained a community. Then imagine agents arriving with sealed documents and pay chests, offering new terms that concentrated power in the hands of a few. The shift is not instantaneous, because arrangements of production are social and durable. But once a company commands the guns at sea and the coin in the city, a gradual erosion begins. Young people recruited into labor on company lands, customary rights overridden by new claims, disputes settled not by local ties but by military threat. The result, slowly but surely, is dispossession. At the same time, the VOC and its counterparts devised ways to manufacture scarcity and surpluses to their advantage. If a shipment failed at sea, prices climbed. If company agents bought up stocks and withheld them from market, scarcity drove European demand higher. On the other hand, once transplantation efforts succeeded and trees grew in other territories, the company could undercut local producers by flooding markets or shifting production centers. Over time, these strategies reshaped the global map of production. Areas that were once beyond the reach of European control were brought into systems that prioritized export over domestic or regional use. This interplay between scarcity generated by geography and scarcity manufactured by policy is crucial to understand. Nutmeg's original scarcity was honest. Few places grew it. But scarcity can also be a created phenomenon, a product of contracts, blockades, and occasional violence. And when scarcity is manufactured, the moral calculus is altered. The hunger of distant tables is satisfied at the cost of local autonomy. That is the ledger that fuels the title of this story, a spice worth more than blood. Before we move to the islands where the consequences of those calculations were most devastating, it is worth pausing to consider how taste and cultural meaning traveled. The arrival of nutmeg in a European kitchen did not simply import flavor, it imported a story about connection and hierarchy. A nobleman who sprinkled nutmeg over rice or in a sauce could signal cosmopolitan taste and access to global networks. Recipes printed in town books and pamphlets taught cooks how to measure and blend, codifying a set of preferences that soon became fashion. In this way, nutmeg was not just preserved in jars, it was preserved as status. Its circulation created reputational capital as well as monetary profit. Then came the more direct interventions. Company agents who sought to secure supply translated profit motives into strategic operations. They identified islands whose production was indispensable and concluded that control, political, military, and administrative, was the only reliable way to guarantee continuous exports. On some islands, they tried to negotiate exclusive rights. On others, they concluded that coercion would be necessary. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Access to the commodity would be secured, even if it meant displacing the people who had produced it for generations. Again, precise descriptions of who ordered what and when belong in archival research notes, indefinido where necessary, but the pattern has been documented sufficiently by historians to be indisputable. The creation of monopolies sometimes entailed force. The situation that would soon explode into one of the most notorious episodes in nutmeg history centered on a small cluster of islands where the tree was most abundant. These were not sprawling colonies, but tight-knit communities with economies built around a single crop. The island's compactness intensified their vulnerability. A single decision by a powerful external actor could, and did, reshape everything. Company ships arrived with orders and soldiers. Local leaders faced choices with impossible stakes: accept restrictive terms, risk military reprisal, or attempt to defend autonomy with limited means. What follows from here is the story of escalation, from negotiation to ultimatum, from blockade to landing parties. It is a chapter that historians have examined not to titillate, but to understand the mechanisms by which commerce could be enforced by arms, and how a spice's value could justify measures that left indelible scars on communities. The archival traces, company letters, local accounts, and later historical reconstructions paint a picture of confrontation that is at once an economic strategy and a moral lapse. We will stop here, at the moment when the balance tip is about to break, a fleet on the horizon, a set of orders dispatched from a distant office, a village square where decisions will be taken. The consequences that flow next are among the strongest evidence for the claim embedded in the title, that a spice could be regarded as worth more than blood. Those consequences are documented in multiple sources, but many particulars, names of specific commanders, precise dates, and casualty numbers, require careful verification and should be labeled indefinito until validated. For now, return to the sense of that cracked seed. Its aroma, citrus, pine, sweet heat, remains the same across centuries, indifferent to ledgers or treaties. Yet each inhalation carries a layered story, of an island grove tended by generations, of regional traders threading seas, of foreign ships bearing flags and ledgers, and of the slow, sometimes violent reordering of production. Nutmeg's flavor is intimate, its history is expansive. The next phase of the story will move from economic logic to explicit coercion, tracing how companies with military power moved from trade to enforced control, and how those actions reshaped both landscapes and lives. A fleet on the horizon is never only a fleet, it is a signal in slow motion. Sails that blot out the sun in the mind of a village, anchors that will make law of the tides, and men whose ledgers will soon outweigh the claims of custom. The ships from the VOC dropped anchor off Banda and delivered more than trade goods. They delivered the capacity to enforce a market with guns. Local leaders were presented with choices that were not choices at all. Sign over exclusive rights to supply, accept the presence of foreign garrisons, or face the consequences. Negotiations, when they occurred, were shadowed by the presence of cannon and by commanders prepared to use them. Imagine a morning in Banda, smoke rising from drying huts, women laying out bright red arrows to bleach and curl in the sun, children running between clumps of nutmeg trees whose trunks bore the faint scars of generations of tapping. The island's economy moved with a rhythm known intimately to its people. When the fruit ripened, when the rains held long enough for curing, when traders arrived with cloth and copper. Into this rhythm arrived men with uniforms and stamped paper, and then, when resistance hardened, soldiers with muskets. What followed is one of the starkest examples historians point to when they ask how commerce became a cause for violence. The actions that unfolded on the Banda Islands in the early 17th century are documented across a range of sources: company letters, reports from sailors, and later historical accounts that have pieced together events from fragments of archive. Under VOC direction, a campaign of conquest and reorganization transformed the island's social fabric. In response to refusal by local leaders to grant exclusive trading rights or to comply with increasingly coercive demands, company forces carried out punitive operations that included killings, the forced deportation of survivors, and the resettlement of the land with laborers who would work under company supervision. Numerous historians have traced this sequence in detail. Exact casualty figures and the names of every actor involved are matters for archival specialists, and where precise counts are given, sometimes remain contested, indefinito. What is not contested is the pattern. A commercial objective was enforced by military means, and local autonomy was overwhelmed by structured coercion. Those who survived often found their homes altered beyond recognition. Traditional harvest patterns were replaced by regimented schedules, communal decision-making eroded as authority shifted to appointed overseers, and the physical landscape, the groves themselves, was reorganized to serve export volumes rather than local uses. Where Banda had been an archipelago of households tending trees, it became, for the company, a plantation model in embryo: land assigned, labor directed, output measured in sacks bound for Europe. In many cases, the company did not rely solely on local labor. It imported people, enslaved or indentured, from other parts of the archipelago to work under strict supervision. The social consequences of that reorganization rippled outward for generations. One of the more chilling mechanics of monopoly was the attempt to control not just the harvest, but the very right to plant and nurture trees. Orders could be issued limiting who was allowed to possess or cultivate nutmeg saplings. In some documented instances, seeds and seedlings were confiscated, and families were prohibited from replanting without permission. The logic was clear. If only company-sanctioned plots could produce exportable nutmeg, then the bargaining power of independent producers would evaporate. This was economic warfare waged at the scale of orchards. Yet control on paper and control in practice are different. Smuggling, secret exchanges, and the persistence of regional trading networks complicated the company's efforts. Traders in the wider Asian marine world were adept at circumventing monopolies, hiding small quantities in hidden holds, using neutral flags, or trading with partners who had little interest in the VOC's court battles. Those porous practices show a historical truth. Monopoly is never total for long, because human ingenuity finds margins to exploit. Still, for a crucial period, the VOC's intense focus on the Banda Islands gave it an effective stranglehold on nutmeg supplies to Europe, and that stranglehold had immediate economic effects. The price of nutmeg in European markets reflected this supply geometry. When shipments arrived on time and in expected quantities, prices fell to more ordinary levels. When a ship sank, when a disease hit the trees, or when political friction interrupted trade, prices spiked. Those price swings mattered for more than gourmands. They mattered for the funding of fleets, for the feasibility of colonial projects, and for the fortunes of merchants who risked long voyages. Nutmeg's economic volatility made it a speculative commodity. Fortunes could be won or lost on the success of a single cargo. As the VOC tightened production, it also pursued botanical strategies. The transplantation of nutmeg to other colonies was a form of strategic diversification. If the company could cultivate the tree in territories where it had firmer political control, it would lessen the leverage of any single island. Transporting living saplings across long sea voyages demanded horticultural care. Nurseries had to be kept moist, seedlings shaded, and soil tended. When transplantation succeeded, it undercut monopoly by adding new sources of supply, albeit under the same imperial management. In the longer arc of history, transplantation also had the paradoxical effect of democratizing the spice. If nutmeg could be grown in multiple places, it would eventually cease to be an exclusive luxury accessible only to the very wealthy. But that democratization was neither immediate nor gentle. Some islands remained embroiled in conflict as the company asserted control. Others saw the arrival of settler planters and newly imported labor systems that resembled plantation economies elsewhere. The rhythm of life on these islands shifted from a mosaic of household plots to larger estates oriented toward export. For many local people, that meant loss of sovereignty over land, loss of traditional livelihoods, and loss of the social structures that had governed production and exchange. And yet, even under coercion, practices persisted. Some islanders continued to tend private trees in secret, others negotiated roles as intermediaries, and some adapted by integrating export crops into older patterns of subsistence. Beyond the immediate human toll, the nutmeg trade reshaped geopolitical patterns. Control of the spice reinforced naval presence, and naval presence reinforced commercial dominance. Ports that serviced the spice trade became nodes in the larger webs of empire, where military, administrative, and economic functions overlapped. The VOC, with its private armies and warehouses, blurred the line between mercantile interest and imperial governance. These institutions would later be invoked as a model and a warning of how corporations could wield state-like authority abroad. As control passed through these hands, the cultural meaning of nutmeg shifted. In Europe, it remained a symbol of luxury, but it also came to represent knowledge of the globe. To know nutmeg was to know routes, ports, and the networks that connected courts and kitchens. It became a fashionable addition to elite cooking, featured in recipes that circulated in printed pamphlets and household manuals. Apothecaries continued to recommend it for various remedies, and its scent found its way into perfumes and ointments. At the same time, satirists and commentators began to use spices as shorthand in critiques of luxury, trade, and the moral economy of consumption. Nutmeg stood at the intersection of appetite and conscience. Over the next centuries, several forces altered how nutmeg functioned in the world economy. Botanical transplantation, the growth of alternative sources of flavor, and changes in shipping and storage technology all played a role. New plantations in other tropical zones, some established through smuggling of plant material, others through deliberate colonial projects, broke the earlier concentration of supply. As the supply base widened, prices began to stabilize, and the spice gradually moved from the realm of exclusive luxury into more common culinary use. But the shift in accessibility did not erase the history that produced it. Instead, it layered that history beneath everyday habit, making the spice ubiquitous and simultaneously most consumers unaware of the stories embedded in its brown shell. The story does not end with the decline of monopolies. In the modern period, nutmeg production is entwined with global supply chains that resemble, in form if not in degree, the structures of the early VOC. Intermediaries who aggregate product, firms that control shipping and distribution, and market actors who translate farm gate prices into retail costs. Today, large volumes of nutmeg come from Indonesia, where production on some islands remains significant, and from a scattering of other producers who supply both local and international markets. Many producers are smallholders, families who tend a few trees and sell harvests through local collectors, while others work on larger estates or for export-oriented firms. The structural inequality first set in motion centuries ago has not wholly vanished. It has mutated into contemporary debates over fair pay, market access, and the right of small producers to capture more value from their product. There are other continuities too, cultural memory and memory's erasure. On some islands, the events of the 17th century remain part of oral histories, embedded in stories told across generations. Elsewhere, the narrative has been smoothed over by the rhythms of daily life and by the demands of globalization. Commemoration sometimes occurs, local ceremonies, academic studies, and occasional public markers, but much of that history remains obscure to the global consumer who picks a plastic jar of ground nutmeg off a grocery shelf. This uneven memory is itself a product of power, which histories are taught widely and which are relegated to specialist archives or forgotten altogether. There are also modern ethical questions that follow directly from the story. If a spice's flavor is inseparable from a history of dispossession, what does ethical consumption look like? The answer is not simple. Certification schemes, fair trade initiatives, and direct trade models attempt to redirect profit toward producers, but they cannot, by themselves, erase centuries of dispossession. They can, however, alter margins and improve transparency. For consumers, the ethical task is twofold: to be curious about provenance and to support structures that empower producers, cooperatives, equitable contracts, and advocacy for policies that protect land rights. In other words, tasting and knowing can be linked. Culinary pleasure and historical awareness need not be opposed. There's also a botanical epilogue. Nutmeg and mace are the same plant's different voices, kernel and aril, but their fates diverged across markets and cultures. The botanical specificity that made the spice rare in the first place, its dependence on particular ecological conditions and human stewardship, reminds us that many of the world's valued products are not simply manufactured out of nothing. They are the results of ecosystems tended by people over generations. That realization complicates easy narratives of globalization. The commodity flow we see on supermarket shelves is rooted in place, practice, and memory. What then does it mean to say nutmeg was worth more than blood? The phrase is not a literal accounting, but a moral measurement. It captures the idea that, at moments in history, the economic value assigned to a commodity was allowed to justify extreme human costs. When company officials weighed profit against the lives of islanders, and when governors decided that control of supply required violent enforcement, the arithmetic placed spice above life in practice, if not in law. That unsettling fact forces us to look differently at the banal pleasures of the table: the scent of mace in a pie, the warming dust of nutmeg on a pudding. These sensory comforts have trajectories that pass through histories of dispossession and enforcement, and yet, to end on despair would be to miss the complex resilience of human communities. Where brutal policies sought to replace local life with export models, people adapted, resisted, and preserved elements of their culture. Some descendants of island communities have reclaimed narratives, teaching younger generations about ancestral practices. Elsewhere, islands that lost much have built new identities that acknowledge trauma while seeking economic renewal. In the culinary world, too, chefs and food historians have begun to emphasize provenance, telling stories about where flavors come from and the people who make them. Such acts do not repair all wounds, but they change the relationship between consumer and producer, from one of oblivious consumption to one of informed engagement. The final image returns us to that first seed. Hold it between your thumb and forefinger and notice its unassuming size, its rough shell. Crack it with a simple tool and the scent spills out, warm, peppered, slightly sweet. And for a moment you stand in a kitchen that could be anywhere. Yet that aroma carries an entire history, of islands where trees were tended, of traders who crossed seas, of companies that wielded both ledger and cannon, and of lives that were reorganized to serve distant appetites. The spice's sensual ease on the tongue belies the hard history beneath it. If this story has shifted how you think about the next pinch of nutmeg you use, tell us in the comments. What surprised you most, or what would you like to know next about the global histories hidden in our food? For now, carry the image of the seed with both wonder and responsibility. The history of nutmeg asks us to taste with memory, to savor, but not to forget the price that was paid to make flavor portable across the globe. If you found this exploration meaningful, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone curious about the histories that flavor our lives.